Hey everyone, the teasing is done, the hinting, the talking about is over. Today is the day. It is the Budget Cooler Showdown 2018 Part 2. Also threw in a little extra. We have an AMD Wraith Prism RGB in the mix as well. Let's take a look, as you can see actually in the picture, what we're actually comparing. But let's dive a little bit deeper and talk about the contenders. So, this is what we have going on today. The AMD Wraith Prism RGB, it was in the box from my 2700X. I do use a different cooler now. It is very expensive. It's $75. I normally wouldn't test this, but as I'll talk about a little bit later, I couldn't use a stock cooler either just because there's some limitations when it comes to performance. We also have the Deep Cool Iceblade 200M. This is a 92 millimeter dual fan, so two fans on the front and back, single tower cooler. It is smaller, so we'll fit some smaller form factor systems, not low profile, but smaller. The reigning champ from 2017, the Deep Cool Gammaxx 400, is making its return today. Of course, I just re-unboxed it, so you probably knew that. But you also should know these two if you've seen the videos that I've put up recently. The Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo, the most popular budget CPU cooler of all time, and its sexier twin brother, the Cooler Master MA410P RGB. It basically is the same exact cooler, same amount of heat pipes, just their air balance, addressable RGB fans. So, for testing purposes, I ran everything 3 times and averaged the totals. All the temperatures were adjusted to 20 degrees ambient. So if you subtract 20 degrees from all these tests, that is the increase from ambient. The temperatures range from 18 to 22 degrees C, and I measured the temperature, pretty much kept an eye on it in front of the case, just notating that if it stayed at a temperature for a while, that's a temperature I used. 8 to 64, ran CPU, FP, memory, and GPU at full speed. I did decide to use the same thermal paste. I was really up in the air on this. It actually came down to one main thing. I'm going to be selling these coolers or using them or whatever have you, and I would have liked to keep the stock paste for selling purposes. Also, it's going to keep our test pretty consistent. So you could have gone either way. That's the route that I went. I gave 1 minute cooldowns between all tests, and I used the default fan profiles on all coolers and Molex power for the case fans. Speaking of the case fans, let's take a look at the test bench. And welcome to the build. We have a Ryzen 5 1600. You can get Amazon for $130 right now. A Gigabyte B450M DS3H. That is just a board I had on hand, but it worked fine. I used some memory from ADATA, XPG Spectrix D41, running at 3000 megahertz for the whole test. A 480 gig SSD from SanDisk. We had a WD Black 2 terabyte, really didn't do anything. A Sapphire RX 478 gig. Got that for 130. NZXT H440. The one I use is black and blue, but you can buy one for as cheap as $85. And a power supply from Corsair, a CXM650. So that is the system. Let's take a look at the OC profile so you can see what kind of test you can expect. So most of these results are overclocked. There are a couple I did at stock, and you will see which of the test results are stock versus overclocked. But for the OC profile, I did go for a 4 gigahertz all-core overclock, and that was sustained, not just boost. The memory did stay at 3000 megahertz during the whole test, so that didn't change no matter stock or OC. And the GPU was not OC'd at all. To get the 4 gigahertz overclock, now I did not fine tune this, I just kind of picked some numbers that I knew would work, and it tested out and it did, and that was 1.425 volts versus it's at stock it's about 1.25, so I added 0.2 volts to the core, and the SoC I brought up to right around 1.2, adding 0.1 volts to the SoC, and then the RAM was at 1.35 volts to hit the 3000 megahertz rated speed of the RAM. So now that we have that out of the way, let's take a look at Cinebench multi-core at stock. This chart is incredibly boring, but let me explain the theory behind this. This is at stock. Now, we don't have XFR2, so this is why you don't see a big difference. But it's pretty much safe to say, and you'll see this on the temperature chart in the next chart here, but they all pretty much ran almost identical at stock. There really wasn't much difference in scores and temperature. There's a little bit of difference in temperature, but nowhere near enough to even cause a little hiccup in the score. So for performance-wise, at stock, you can expect the same no matter which cooler you go with. But let's take a really quick look at the temps before we do some overclocking. Now, lower is better pretty much going forward, but I will bring that up again. At stock, the Wraith Prism actually fell behind even the Ice Blade 200M. Mind you, it's at stock. The Gammaxx 400 actually just edged out its little brother. It did also tie the Hyper 212. And the MA410P actually won. Mind you, it's the same cooler, but there's a really good chance that because it's different fan and different fan profile, that's why it performed a little bit better on the lower end. But let's take a look at some overclocking. Now we're starting to get a little bit of differentiation. I was a little bit surprised that on this test, the Wraith Prism actually outperformed the Ice Blade 200M. Now, mind you, this cooler is rated to 125 watts, whereas the cooler comes with the Ryzen 5 is really designed for potentially up to like 95 to 100 watts. So it did outperform it. Mind you, it's very expensive. The Gammaxx 400, the reigning champ from last year, came in about 65. The Cooler Master MA410P came at 63, losing out to its twin but not as sexy brother, the Hyper 212 EVO. So this is kind of what I kind of expected, what kind of separation. But let's take a look at Intel burn test. Now, this test had me tear up a little bit, but I'll explain. So the Ice Blade 200M falls behind the Wraith Prism again, but the Gammaxx 400 potentially could be losing its reigning champion #1 spot. Both the Hyper 212 EVO and his sexier twin brother, the MA410P RGB, outperformed it by a decent amount, 5 and 6 degrees Celsius. Do note on this test that the two brothers flip-flop, with the RGB cooler actually beating out the more plain Jane Hyper 212 EVO. But let's take a look at IDA 64. So, IDA 64 is really the test I like, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm looking at full GPU load within the system as well as a full CPU load to give you a little bit of a worst case scenario. Interestingly enough, the Ice Blade 200M did fine with the GPU, but the CPU peaked at 95 degrees Celsius with a consistent load of around 86 degrees Celsius. Overclocked, I would definitely back that down. That's a little bit too hot. Even in gaming, I feel like it would probably be, at least in the lower 80s. The Wraith Prism actually did a little bit better by 2 degrees. Interestingly enough, the GPU ran hotter on the Wraith Prism, and my theory behind that is it didn't have a CPU fan pushing air out the back through the rear fan. The Gammaxx 400 slipped. It did fine, 86 degrees peak, 76 degrees sustained load, but it got beat out again by the Cooler Master brothers. So here we are, the Hyper 212 EVO, 82 degrees peak at a 74 degrees sustain, and then the M410P, 82 degrees peak as well, but a 72 degrees sustained load. Now this was also run for about 15 minutes, adjusted to 20 degrees ambient temperature within the room, which, as I mentioned earlier, it ranged between 18 and 22. So I want to keep the results as consistent as possible. But let's talk a little bit more about the test overall. Let's talk about value and pricing. I want to show you this test for one reason. The coolers we're working with are rated from probably around 120 watts to 160 on the CPU. Intel burn test had the highest heat output from just the CPU. But it's important to note that IDA 64 had an open air cooled GPU stress, so that was actually dumping more hot air into the system and raised the inside ambient temperature, which is why the temperatures were higher, right? That's why I did that test. And the overclocked Cinebench benchmark was pretty similar, around 100 watts. But interestingly enough, at stock, the CPU didn't really go much over 65, like 67, 68, which is why the temps were well within range. This test took a lot of math, so let me explain what we're looking at. The yellow bars, what they're representing, which is a top bar, is system and cooler value. So the cheapest overall system with the cooler would be 100%. If the cooler is more expensive, it has a lower value rating. The orange, or the middle one, is the performance relative to the MA410P. I averaged the overclocked temperatures and then did 100% based off of, that was the best performing one. And then I do an interesting one, which is multiply these two together and give an overall cost versus performance. Now, I did a full system value, not individual cooler value, because it looked trash overall, and I wasn't trying to do that. So the red marking is really important because that gives you the value of the cooler in relation to its performance and the entire cost of the system. So the Cooler Master Brothers did very well, 98% overall. Obviously, this isn't going to have 100% value given the fact we're multiplying a couple together. The Gammaxx 400 came in at 94%, and the Ice Blade 200M at 85%, and then the Wraith Prism at 82%, no shocker, $75 CPU, that was second to last. So that is, it's an interesting chart, but just understand how I came up with these numbers. And the winner is the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo. And it didn't win because of performance or value. It won because it did extremely well in both of those, but its fan is a lot better. So the addressable RGB air balance fan that Cooler Master makes is loud. All of mine make a really weird noise that sound like a pump, like water going through the pump, and I have like 10 of them. I have like seven of these. They all make that sound. I don't like it. It looks cool, but I don't like it. I would take a Hyper 212 Evo, or maybe just get like a better pressurized RGB fan or something like that. But then there's other coolers you can buy for that. Why didn't I include the stock cooler with the Ryzen chip? I've done that before. The problem is that when I tested the Wraith Prism, which is the first one I tested because I thought about this, and I saw that we were in the low 90s with a cooler that's rated to 125 watts of power, I knew the Ryzen stock cooler I didn't want to damage the CPU, I didn't want to damage the board. So that was the reason why. The stock cooler is perfectly fine for stock and a little bit overclock. We were boosting from 3.2 to 4 gigahertz at about 1.25 volts. 1.25 volts is about where it peaked at. 1.237, I believe, is the number. Now, why did I include the Master Liquid Light 120? Well, you can't buy that anymore for around $40. They've replaced with an RGB variant, and it's more expensive. That being said, I've had a couple pump failures in some coolers I've worked with, and the performance is really close. Especially, I would go to say the Hyper 212 Evo probably would perform a little bit better or on par based off of last year's results. So I'm not really interested in doing that. Now the question is what's next? Well, I'm going to tease you a little bit. I have some retro AM3 versus AM4 coming. I'm pretty sure I have some unboxings coming. I have a lot of stuff filmed. This is like middle of November. You guys are going to get this in a week or two. But I have something for you. Stay tuned. I don't know when this video is dropping. I have all the results. i9 9900K versus Ryzen 7 2700X. The real test. 1440p, 144 Hz with a 1080 Ti. I did the real test between these two CPUs, and I really recommend staying tuned. I did this test myself. A customer of mine was 9900K that I built, and he allowed me to do the testing. So let's just say that I did it my way, and the results are quite interesting to say the least. So stay tuned to that. That is coming. But if you have any questions, leave a comment, send me a message on YouTube. However you want to get a hold of me, get a hold of me. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. If you want to buy anything, features, videos, CPU, coolers, whatever, Amazon links in the description. There's been a lot of sales going. Follow those links. Helps me out a lot. If you liked the video, hit that like button. If you disliked the video, definitely that's fine. Hit that dislike button. But let me know why you didn't like it, because that's going to help me to improve. But as always, this is Steve from PC Budget Solutions, and I'll see you later on down the road.